Star Wars The Bad Batch. Now, in terms of a Star Wars show being looked down upon or forgotten, I think this fits the bill perfectly for that. I think Star Wars The Bad Batch is one of the best Star Wars in general, and obviously one of the best TV shows if I'm saying it's one of the best pieces of Star Wars possible. And I want to lay out why, because a year later I decided to go back and rewatch the whole thing, and let me say I was even more blown away this time around than I was the first time around. And obviously there's a lot of reasons why, and we're going to get into it, but just, from a 30-foot view, I think this show does not get anywhere near the respect that it deserves in terms of storytelling, character development, the world building in actual Star Wars itself, and then of course the branches that it creates. You have the potential shows with Echo and Rex afterwards, and how they end up saving the clones, and they can explore that later. But in terms of a Star Wars show being, I don't want to say the word disrespected, but completely forgotten, this is up there. The characters in this show, well, I mean, obviously they are the heart and soul of what makes the Bad Batch so great. And one thing that I think a ton of people really overlook, and a lot of scrutiny I see about the Bad Batch itself, is there's a lot of filler, and there's a ton of episodes that are just filler, and that can be true. There is some episodes that are definitely filler episodes, but what I think a lot of people tend to kind of not think about holistically is this is a show that is supposed to follow a crew of clones who all they've ever known is fighting and war and the Republic, adjust to a life that isn't that anymore. And what we see is the character growth. Obviously the first person to believe in Omega is Hunter, and their relationship is kind of the catalyst of the show. The relationship where Hunter has to face becoming a dad and kind of adopting to Omega being a child and having to raise her in a way that's not fully about war, and kind of look at her as, a daughter figure. That's kind of where the show starts off. And obviously you see our Bad Batch struggle. Wrecker kind of has to learn a hard lesson in the first season where he creates the room for Omega, and that's a good, character growth moment. And then an episode that I really appreciate that doesn't get talked about a lot is when they were in the mines and Echo had left the Bad Batch, and Tech and Omega had a moment in the cavern where Omega falls and Tech doesn't hesitate. He jumps right in the water right after her. And it's those character building moments that I feel are not appreciated as much as they should be, because this is a very personable show. And watching our characters grow, watching Crosshair betray the Bad Batch, but then bring up the very valid point where, the Bad Batch did decide to leave him. And I rewatched that episode where he chose to stay with the Empire, and they could have went and grabbed him when, they had finished off most of his squad, and they definitely could have turned around and grabbed him. But they didn't, because he made his choice. But a lot of where the Bad Batch makes their bread and butter is watching. You almost feel like you become a part of the family watching the show, watching them struggle, and watching Echo adapt and try and fight his internal battle where he goes to the Bad Batch and says we should be doing more. But that's also another critique that I see a lot is, why didn't the Bad Batch do more for the regular clones? Well, we know that the Bad Batch doesn't like the regular clones. We saw that in the Clone Wars where, they got in a fight in the mess hall. Things like that. The Bad Batch should not be fighting that war because, yes, they are clones, but they're different. They're on a different path. They have Omega. They have a different direction. And you watch Echo kind of struggle with that as he goes back and forth between the Bad Batch and being with Rex, and watching him adapt. And it is nice that he comes back in Season 3 a couple times, and he decides to be with the Bad Batch. But obviously I think they're going to make a spin-off show based off of that, and I hope they do, because it's really good content. It's amazing, and you love to root for Rex and Echo and the clones. Um, but the characters of the show are the main engine and the main driver behind it. Granted, the story is great, but is it as good as the Clone Wars? No. But it does feel a lot more personable. Because, I mean, there's only so many characters, and you watch them get betrayed at every turn by Sid, by, well, in the beginning, it felt like Nala Se and the Kaminoans, but in reality, Nala Se was trying to protect Omega, which is a great turn of events. But you watch these clones who have no idea what's going on in the universe try and survive, and I think it's taken for granted how challenging that reality is for them to go through and try and navigate. So I like to credit Dave Filoni and the writers of the show, even though those episodes are filler. I think it's character growth. I think it's great character growth. I think you get to see how much they grow towards the end of the show as not only clones but people in the universe as well. But that's as the whole character view and how they grow and adapt throughout the show. Characters specifically, I think Hunter remains the most constant. Hunter and Wrecker, I think, are the most constant characters throughout the show. Hunter from day one is pretty much the same clone, albeit a little more mature, and obviously he's had to adapt as the leader. But from start to finish, I think he's extremely similar. Wrecker is the comic relief. Obviously, he is, he's there to scream and make funny comments, and he is funny. I really appreciate Wrecker's character in the show, but I wouldn't say he changed a whole lot. He was a big teddy bear inside, and you can see that when he interacts with Omega. So that's nothing new. Tech, I wouldn't say grows a ton. He's very monotone, very, very straight arrow. You kind of know what you're getting from Tech. But you do see his character grow in terms of building a relationship with Omega and not looking her so much as... Because, the scene that really encapsulates Tech's personality, there's two of them that I can remember very vividly. The first is when they were escaping Kamino with Crosshair when he was with the Empire. And Wrecker was arguing with Crosshair about why he didn't come back or whatever. And Tech goes, oh, that's just his personality. He's always known to be stubborn and unyielding. So obviously that's true, but it's not. Nobody's going to look at somebody and just accept them like that. So Tech kind of just doesn't give as much credit to people's personalities. Not that he actually gives too much credit to the personalities, but he doesn't give enough human element into these analysis that he has, and I just think it's funny. But you do see him do that towards Omega towards the end after Echo had left and she was upset and Tech didn't show much emotion about it. He ends up, consoling Omega and helping her feel better after they fell in the water. But that's kind of that was the most emotional growth I've seen from him. And I mean, lo and behold, Echo, you saw his struggle, like I mentioned earlier, with his, we should be doing more to help the clones because he is a regular clone. But obviously the Bad Batch don't have the same relationship that Echo did with the clones, so that was kind of his personal battle. And you see that throughout the show. That's pretty obvious. But the most impactful one is Crosshair. And Crosshair's growth from becoming part of the team to being affected by Order 66 to removing his chip at some unknown point, probably when he got blasted by the Venator engine, to, realizing the Empire doesn't really care about him and Rampart was just using him, to his redemption story. And I think Crosshair's redemption wasn't rushed. It was sometimes you see this in shows where they try and redeem a character, but his wasn't rushed. It wasn't. It was obvious. I wouldn't say it was obvious, but it was pretty clear that he was going to come, back to the Bad Batch at some point. But it wasn't obvious how he was going to, and the timeline it took all 3 seasons for him to kind of make that turnaround, and it's all kind of brought together towards the end in one final big bow on top when Omega trusts Crosshair to take that shot to break the handcuffs that is holding her to Hemlock, and that's really the first time you see Hunter fully trust him to take that shot and trust him as a person. And I really, really appreciated how well they handled Crosshair and his return to the Bad Batch. Like, I really, really, really think they did an amazing job with that. And I think it's the best character growth we've seen in a while. I think it's the biggest full circle moment we've seen in a while. So I really appreciate the Bad Batch for that, and I appreciate Crosshair and all of the different characters we've seen for giving us that. The story of the Bad Batch is excellent, in my opinion. Obviously, we touched on it earlier about how it's about clones that try and make their way through the universe after the Republic has ditched them and, rendered them basically useless. But I also really, really enjoyed seeing all these different. I did not expect to see Project Necromancer and the Emperor involved in this deep of a show. And looking at what we got compared to what I expected, I did not expect the show to get this deep into this kind of storyline. And the way that they kind of went about it, I think makes complete total sense. It didn't feel like anything was super out of place. They did a great job building, Hemlock to be this big villain in season 3, and it made sense why they needed Omega. And seeing Hemlock's and Tarkin's kind of feud throughout the show is also really great to see. And that's kind of the thing about this show is, yes, it has its silly moments, but the actual story behind it makes sense, and it is amazing, in my opinion. You get to see Scorch, you get to see all these characters where you see them, and it makes sense. Nothing feels out of place, or it's like, you know what, maybe this should have been saved for something else. And I really do think they did a great job with that. Do I think they could have went a little deeper with everything? Sure, but you can say that about pretty much everything. But for the expectations coming into the show and where they ended up taking it, I think it really excelled in that category. Looking at some of the individual storylines of the show is where it really shines. The underlying per episode kind of storylines that they have going on, I think, is absolutely stellar. So ones that I would like to point out is, I think the show starts off with a bang. I mean, that first episode I think is fantastic. I think it's some of the best Star Wars I've seen. Watching the direct aftermath of Order 66 and seeing how the Bad Batch, obviously they don't fit in anywhere, but how opposite they are towards everything, and to see what the universe looks like afterwards, I think is so unbelievably amazing. Seeing how they handle, Caleb Dune and all that stuff is, I mean, top tier Star Wars, absolutely top tier Star Wars. And then seeing how the clones, specifically Hauser and Mayday, seeing how they kind of learn to be an individual throughout Order 66 and their chip doesn't work as much, I think that's absolutely fascinating. Watching how they become individuals and kind of don't agree with the Empire is so freaking cool, in my opinion. Seeing how they grow as individuals, and then watching Mayday's effect on Crosshair as Crosshair takes his own character journey to find, make his way back to the Bad Batch, I think is phenomenal. I think we kind of take it a little bit for granted because the Bad Batch it followed the best Star Wars we've ever seen in terms of the last season of the Clone Wars. So seeing, if the Bad Batch had came out after something like The Acolyte, I think would be received a lot better. And it would have been a little more attention grabbing. But watching those little storylines and how they interact, I think is so cool, and I think it's something I myself will cherish. And in terms of story, I think if I had to give it a grade, I'd give it a B+. to wrap things up, I think the ending of Star Wars The Bad Batch is one of the best endings we've gotten in Star Wars history. I actually just, before I started recording this, I just rewatched it again. And oh my goodness, it is such a perfect ending in terms of, in the beginning of The Bad Batch, it started with Hunter and Omega and kind of their relationship being the catalyst for all the other clones building that relationship with her. And then it ends with Hunter saying, "Time hasn't dulled all my senses," and he knew that Omega was going to run off to join the rebellion. And her joining the rebellion in its own right is just an amazing feature of her character, knowing that that's something that she would do. So I think that was awesome as well. And then just looking at Hunter's character and them kind of getting that final goodbye, to me made a lot of sense, and I thought it was a perfect note to end on. And hopefully we get a spin-off show where, Omega's in the rebellion and they have to come save her, because at the end he says, "Don't worry, Omega, if you ever need us, we'll be there." And that hit home for me really well, and I really appreciate this show as a whole. So, yeah, thank you. Throw a like and subscribe.